Ethan Cross, a man whose name resonated across the corridors of power and wealth, sat in the quiet stillness of his penthouse office. The golden hue of the Manhattan skyline reflected on the glass walls, but the beauty of the view was lost on him. His hands rested on the polished oak desk, his thoughts swirling with uncertainty. For a man who thrived on control, the creeping feeling of powerlessness was unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. Ethan wasn't sure when it started, but something had shifted in his marriage. Sophia, the love of his life, the woman who had once filled their home with laughter and warmth, now seemed a world away. Her eyes didn't linger on his like they used to, and her smile felt forced, like she was keeping something locked inside. He had tried to convince himself it was just a phase, a temporary lull in the rhythm of their lives, but the doubts gnawed at him, refusing to be silenced. Sophia had always been his grounding force, the one person who saw him as more than a billionaire or a CEO. She had loved him for who he was, not for what he could offer. But now, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that she was drifting away, retreating into a part of her life he no longer had access to, and the unanswered questions lingered, tormenting him in the quiet hours of the night. Ethan wasn't a man to ignore a problem. He had built his empire on decisiveness and action, and this situation would be no different. But confronting Sophia outright felt wrong. What if his suspicions were unfounded? What if he pushed her further away by doubting her? No, he needed to understand what was happening without disrupting the fragile balance of their relationship. That's when the idea came to him, startling in its simplicity. The solution wasn't to confront Sophia, but to observe her. He needed to see her world as she lived it, to understand the parts of her life that she kept hidden from him, and the only way to do that was to step outside of his own carefully crafted identity. The plan was bold, even reckless, but Ethan was no stranger to risk. Within 2 days, his transformation was complete. Gone were the tailored suits and Italian leather shoes that defined his public image. In their place were a simple black suit, a crisp white shirt and a plain tie, the uniform of a professional driver. His hair, normally styled to perfection, was tucked beneath a baseball cap, and a pair of cheap glasses obscured his piercing blue eyes. In this disguise, he was unrecognizable, just another anonymous chauffeur blending into the city's chaos. Greg, his longtime driver and confidant, had been skeptical when Ethan first proposed the idea. "Sir, are you sure about this? It seemed extreme." "I need to do this, Greg," Ethan had replied firmly. "I need to know what's going on in her life, and this is the only way." Greg had eventually relented, though not without a resigned shake of his head. He helped Ethan set up a rideshare account under a fake name and ensured the car, a modest black sedan, was ready for the job. And now, as Ethan sat behind the wheel outside his own home, waiting for Sophia to emerge, he felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The front door opened, and there she was. Sophia stepped out onto the brownstone's front steps, her figure framed by the soft morning light. She was dressed in a pale blue blouse and tailored slacks, her hair cascading over her shoulders in loose waves. She looked effortlessly elegant, but there was a tension in her posture that Ethan hadn't noticed before. Was it his imagination, or was she carrying some invisible weight? Ethan lowered his gaze as she approached the car, careful not to meet her eyes. She slid into the back seat, her movements graceful yet deliberate. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm but distant. "Good morning, ma'am," Ethan replied, his voice carefully modulated to disguise its usual timbre. Sophia gave him a polite smile before turning her attention to her phone. Ethan stole a glance at her through the rearview mirror. She was scrolling through her messages, her expression unreadable. The silence in the car was thick, each second stretching longer than the last. She finally spoke. "Could you take me to La Petite Café on 12th Street? "Of course, ma'am," Ethan said, tapping the address into the GPS. The drive was uneventful, the sound of the city filtering in through the closed windows. Sophia remained absorbed in her phone, occasionally typing out a message or reading something that brought a faint smile to her lips. Ethan's mind raced with questions. Who was she texting? Was it something innocent? Or was there a deeper story behind that smile? When they arrived at the cafe, Sophia thanked him politely and stepped out of the car. Ethan watched her disappear into the cozy little shop, his curiosity burning. He couldn't simply drive away, not now. Parking the car a block away, he donned a scarf and sunglasses to further obscure his appearance before heading toward the cafe. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and inviting, with the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Ethan spotted Sophia immediately. She was sitting at a small table near the window across from a woman with bright red hair. The two were deep in conversation, their heads close together. Ethan ordered a coffee and positioned himself at a nearby table, pretending to scroll through his phone while straining to catch snippets of their exchange. "Thank you for coming," Sophia was saying. "I just needed someone to talk to." "Of course," the red-haired woman replied. "You seemed so stressed the last time we spoke. How's everything at home?" Sophia hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. "It's fine. Ethan's been busy, as usual. He means well, but sometimes it feels like we're living in different worlds." Ethan's stomach tightened. Was that how she felt? That they were growing apart? The red-haired woman reached across the table, placing a hand on Sophia's. "You're allowed to feel frustrated, you know. It doesn't mean you don't love him." Sophia nodded, her eyes glistening. "I just wish he could see how much I miss us. The way things used to be before everything got so complicated." Ethan's heart ached at her words. He had been so consumed by work, so focused on building his empire, that he had neglected the very foundation of his happiness. But what complicated things was the nagging feeling that there was more she wasn't saying. The conversation shifted, and the women began discussing a volunteer project Sophia was involved in, something Ethan had no knowledge of. She spoke passionately about the children at the community center she visited twice a week, her eyes lighting up as she described their resilience and joy. As Ethan listened, he felt a swell of pride for her compassion and dedication. But alongside that pride was a sharp pang of guilt. How had he missed this part of her life? How had he become so blind to the things that mattered most to her? Sophia left the cafe after an hour, her mood seemingly lighter than when she had arrived. Ethan returned to the car, his thoughts a whirlwind of emotion. As she settled into the back seat once more, she seemed lost in her own world, gazing out the window with a wistful expression. The drive home was quiet, the air between them charged with unspoken words. Ethan stole glances at her through the mirror, his heart heavy with the realization that the woman he loved was carrying burdens he hadn't even noticed. When they reached the house, Sophia thanked him again and disappeared inside. Ethan sat in the car for a long time, staring at the door she had closed behind her. His mind was spinning, and for the first time in years, he felt utterly lost. He had set out to uncover the truth about Sophia's world, and what he had seen so far was both inspiring and heartbreaking. But there was more to this story, more he needed to understand. And as he sat there in the quiet of the car, one thing became clear. His journey was far from over. Ethan Cross sat in the darkened corner of his penthouse, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. The vibrant hum of Manhattan felt distant, muffled by the storm of emotions brewing inside him. His mind replayed the events of the previous day in a relentless loop. Sophia's radiant smile as she spoke with the children at the shelter, the warmth in her voice that he hadn't heard in months, and above all, the tension in her words when she spoke of their life together. "I just wish he could see how much I miss us." Those words lingered in his thoughts, piercing deeper than he cared to admit. Ethan had built his empire with unrelenting determination, climbing to the pinnacle of wealth and influence. Yet now, he couldn't help but feel that he had overlooked the most important aspect of his life, his marriage. Sophia's happiness, her laughter, her love, these were the things that once defined his world. And now they felt like fading memories, slipping further out of reach. He rubbed his temples, his mind racing with questions. What had gone wrong? And why hadn't Sophia told him about the shelter, about this entire other life she had built outside their marriage? She had always been open with him, or so he thought. Now, as he pieced together the fragments of her world, he realized how little he truly knew about the woman he loved. One image stood out from the day before. The man at the shelter, Matt. Ethan couldn't ignore the familiarity between him and Sophia, the ease with which they spoke, the way Matt's eyes lingered on her just a moment too long. Was this the person she had been talking to on the phone? The thought made Ethan's chest tighten, a bitter knot of jealousy and insecurity forming in his gut. But he wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. He needed more answers, more clarity. If he pushed too soon, he risked driving her further away. And so he resolved to continue his charade as her driver for just a little longer, even as the weight of his own deception began to gnaw at him. The next morning, Ethan arrived outside their brownstone just as Sophia stepped out the door. She was dressed simply but elegantly, in a beige coat that accentuated her graceful frame. Her hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, and though her expression was calm, there was a subtle tension in her posture, a hesitance that Ethan couldn't ignore. "Good morning," she said, as she climbed into the back seat, her voice polite but distant. "Good morning, ma'am," Ethan replied, careful to keep his tone neutral. She gave him an address without further explanation, and Ethan punched it into the GPS. The destination was in a part of the city he rarely visited, a quiet residential neighborhood, far from the upscale cafes and boutiques they usually frequented. As they drove, Ethan stole glances at her in the rearview mirror. She wasn't looking at her phone this time, nor was she gazing out the window with her usual air of quiet contemplation. Instead, she seemed restless, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her bag. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Ethan asked, his voice measured and professional. Sophia glanced up, her eyes meeting his briefly in the mirror. "Yes, thank you. Just a lot on my mind." Her response was vague, but Ethan didn't press. He couldn't risk raising her suspicions, even as his curiosity burned brighter with every passing moment. When they arrived, Sophia stepped out of the car and disappeared into the building. A modest structure with a weathered sign that read, "St. Mary's Shelter for Children." Ethan parked a short distance away, his heart pounding as he watched her enter. After a few minutes, Ethan followed her inside, careful to remain inconspicuous. The shelter was lively and welcoming, its walls adorned with colorful artwork and bulletin boards filled with announcements and photographs. Children of all ages filled the space, their laughter and chatter creating an atmosphere of warmth and energy. Ethan spotted Sophia almost immediately. She was sitting on the floor with a group of children, helping them sort through art supplies. Her face was alight with joy, her laughter ringing out as she listened to their stories and encouraged their creativity. A little girl with pigtails held up a drawing. "Miss Sophia, is this good?" Sophia smiled, her expression filled with genuine admiration. "It's beautiful, Clara. You're so talented. Why don't we hang it up on the wall?" Clara beamed, and Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. This was a side of Sophia he hadn't seen in years, a side that was nurturing, patient, and deeply compassionate. She wasn't just volunteering here, she was building connections, creating a sense of belonging for these kids. As Ethan continued to observe from the shadows, a man approached Sophia. It was Matt. "You're a miracle worker, Sophia," Matt said with a grin, holding a clipboard under one arm. "The kids adore you." Sophia laughed lightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm just happy to be here. They give me more than I could ever give them." Matt's gaze lingered on her for a moment, and Ethan's jaw tightened. There was something in the way Matt looked at her that made his stomach churn, a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something Ethan couldn't quite name. For the next hour, Ethan watched as Sophia moved effortlessly through the shelter, helping children with their homework, organizing supplies, and chatting with the staff. She seemed completely at ease here, her smile genuine and unguarded. It was a stark contrast to the guarded expression she often wore at home, and it only deepened Ethan's sense of guilt. When Sophia finally left the shelter, she climbed back into the car with a contented sigh. Ethan glanced at her in the mirror, trying to read her expression. "Did everything go well, ma'am?" he asked casually. "Yes, thank you," she replied, her tone warm but reserved. Ethan nodded, his mind racing with questions. What had brought her to this place, and why hadn't she told him about it? The following day, Sophia directed him to another destination, a quiet park on the outskirts of the city. She carried a small tote bag and walked to a secluded bench where an elderly woman was waiting. Ethan parked nearby, watching as Sophia handed the woman the bag and sat down beside her. The two spoke for nearly an hour, their expressions shifting between solemnity and relief. Whatever they were discussing, it was deeply personal. When Sophia returned to the car, Ethan couldn't resist asking, "Do you volunteer often, ma'am?" Sophia hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. "I try to make time when I can," she said carefully. Her guarded tone set Ethan on edge. He wondered if she was beginning to suspect something, but he couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to uncovering the full truth. That night, Ethan sat alone in his office, staring at the blinking cursor on his computer screen. He had pulled up the rideshare app, scrolling through Sophia's past destinations. Each stop told a story. The shelter, the park, the cafe. They were pieces of a puzzle, fragments of a life he hadn't known she was living. But one destination stood out, a nondescript building in Midtown that she had visited twice in the past week. It wasn't listed as a shelter or a community center, and Ethan couldn't find any information about it online. The mystery only deepened his resolve. Tomorrow he would follow her there. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew it would change everything. Ethan woke early the next morning, his mind clouded by a restless night of half-formed thoughts and dreams that slipped away the moment he opened his eyes. His resolve, however, was sharper than ever. He had spent hours poring over the rideshare app, studying Sophia's routes, and searching for clues in the quiet moments of her routine. Now the time had come to uncover the mystery of the last address she had visited twice in the past week. The location wasn't far, just a modest brick building in Midtown that blended seamlessly into its surroundings. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary office space, with no visible signs or hints of what went on inside. Ethan had researched it late into the night, but the search turned up nothing of note. No company listings, no reviews, no history. It was as though the place didn't exist. Sophia's voice, warm and unassuming, interrupted his thoughts. She stepped into the car, her usual composure slightly fractured by what seemed like nervous energy. Ethan noticed how her hands fidgeted with the strap of her purse and how her gaze lingered on her phone before she tucked it away. "Good morning, ma'am," Ethan said evenly, watching her in the rearview mirror. "Good morning," Sophia replied, her tone polite but distant. She rattled off the address, then settled into her seat, gazing out the window as the city passed by. The drive was quiet, punctuated only by the faint hum of the engine and the occasional buzz of Sophia's phone. Ethan couldn't help but steal glances at her, noting the way her brow furrowed slightly, as if she were lost in thought. He felt a pang of guilt, knowing he was deceiving her, but the questions gnawed at him relentlessly. When they arrived, Sophia hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. She glanced around as though making sure no one was watching, then entered the building through an unmarked door. Ethan parked the car a block away and waited, his pulse quickening as he debated his next move. After 15 minutes, he couldn't take it any longer. Donning his scarf and cap to further conceal his identity, Ethan exited the car and approached the building. The door Sophia had entered was locked, but a side entrance a few steps down led into a dimly lit stairwell. Ethan hesitated, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. This was the closest he had ever come to crossing a line he couldn't uncross. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and slipped inside. The stairwell smelled faintly of cleaning supplies, and his footsteps echoed softly as he descended. At the bottom, he found himself in a narrow hallway with a series of doors, each labeled only by numbers. He strained to listen for any sound, any hint of where Sophia might be, but the air was eerily silent. Finally, he heard muffled voices coming from one of the rooms. He crept closer, his heart pounding, until he reached a door left slightly ajar. Through the crack he could see Sophia sitting at a small table, her posture tense as she spoke with someone he couldn't see. "I just don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Sophia was saying, her voice heavy with emotion. "You're doing everything you can," a man replied, his tone soothing. "You don't have to carry this alone." Ethan's chest tightened as he inched closer, trying to get a better view. The man leaned forward, and Ethan recognized him immediately. Matt, the man from the shelter. "I don't know how to tell him," Sophia continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Ethan has so much on his shoulders already. I can't be the one to make things worse." Ethan felt a jolt of both relief and confusion. This wasn't what he had expected. Whatever they were discussing, it didn't sound romantic, but it was clear that Sophia had been hiding something from him, something that weighed on her deeply. "You'll find the right time," Matt said, "and when you do, he'll understand. He loves you, Sophia, anyone can see that." Sophia nodded, wiping her eyes quickly. "I hope you're right." Ethan stepped back, his mind racing. He couldn't listen anymore, not without betraying the trust he was trying so desperately to salvage. He left the building quietly, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. Back in the car, Ethan waited for Sophia to return. When she finally did, her expression was calm, though her eyes betrayed the faintest trace of emotion. She said nothing as she buckled her seatbelt, and Ethan didn't press her. The drive home was filled with silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Ethan felt the weight of the past few days pressing down on him, the enormity of what he had done sinking in. He had invaded her privacy, spied on her in ways he never thought himself capable of, and yet he still didn't have the answers he sought. That night, Ethan sat alone in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey as he replayed the day's events in his mind. What was Sophia so afraid to tell him? What burden had she been carrying alone for so long? He had seen her strength, her kindness, her unwavering dedication to the children at the shelter, but beneath it all, there was a sadness he couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, Ethan felt truly powerless. The man who had built an empire, who had solved problems no one else could, now found himself unable to bridge the gap between him and the woman he loved. The next morning, Sophia surprised him. "I need to make another stop," she said as she climbed into the car, her voice softer than usual. She handed him an address without further explanation, and Ethan obeyed, his curiosity tempered by a growing sense of unease. The address led them to a small medical office on the outskirts of the city. Ethan's pulse quickened as he watched Sophia enter, her steps hesitant and uncertain. He parked nearby, his mind racing with possibilities. After half an hour, Sophia emerged, carrying a folder in her hands. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a heaviness in her posture that Ethan couldn't ignore. She climbed back into the car without a word, clutching the folder tightly in her lap. "Everything all right, ma'am?" Ethan asked carefully, his voice tinged with genuine concern. Sophia hesitated, her grip on the folder tightening. "Yes," she said finally, though her tone was far from convincing. Ethan wanted to press her, to ask her what was going on, but he held back. The truth would come out in time, it had to. Later that evening, as Ethan sat in the quiet of their living room, Sophia approached him. She looked hesitant, almost vulnerable as she stood in the doorway, clutching the same folder she had carried earlier. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. He looked up, his heart pounding. "What is it, Sophia?" She crossed the room and sat down beside him, her gaze fixed on the folder in her hands. "There's something I need to tell you." Ethan swallowed hard, bracing himself. "I'm listening." Sophia opened the folder, revealing a stack of medical documents. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly as she handed them to him. "I didn't know how to tell you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I couldn't keep it from you any longer." Ethan's eyes scanned the documents, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Words like treatment options and prognosis jumped out at him, each one hitting like a punch to the gut. Sophia's voice broke through the fog of his thoughts. "I was diagnosed a few months ago. It's early, but it's cancer." Ethan stared at her, his breath caught in his throat. The room seemed to tilt around him, the weight of her words threatening to crush him. "I didn't want to burden you," Sophia continued, tears streaming down her face. "You've been so busy, and I didn't want you to feel like you had to carry this too." Ethan reached for her hand, his own trembling as he pulled her into an embrace. "You're not a burden, Sophia. You could never be a burden." The dam of emotions broke and they held each other tightly, the unspoken fears and regrets pouring out between them. In that moment, Ethan realized how blind he had been, how much he had missed while chasing his ambitions. This was his chance to make things right, to fight for Sophia, to fight for their love, and to face whatever challenges lay ahead together. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the words on Sophia's medical documents replayed in his mind like a haunting refrain. Cancer, treatment options, prognosis. Each term carried a weight that seemed impossible to bear. He had built an empire, conquered insurmountable challenges, and thrived in the face of adversity, but none of it mattered now. The thought of losing Sophia eclipsed everything. He sat by the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance as if mocking his helplessness. Sophia had gone to bed hours earlier, exhausted from their conversation and the emotional toll of revealing her secret. Ethan had stayed with her until she fell asleep, holding her hand and silently promising himself that he wouldn't let her face this alone. But now, in the solitude of the night, doubts crept in. How had he missed the signs? Sophia had been distant for months, but instead of looking deeper, he had assumed the worst. His paranoia about Matt, his decision to spy on her, his relentless focus on work, all of it felt petty and meaningless in the face of what she was going through. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Ethan made a decision. He couldn't change the past, but he could change how he supported Sophia from this moment forward. The next morning, Ethan woke early and prepared breakfast for Sophia, something he hadn't done in years. The smell of coffee and freshly scrambled eggs filled the kitchen, and he smiled as he heard her footsteps on the stairs. "Good morning," he said, turning to see her standing in the doorway, her expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Good morning," she replied, her voice soft. "What's all this?" "I thought we could start the day together," Ethan said, pulling out a chair for her. "It's been too long since we had a proper breakfast." Sophia smiled faintly and took her seat. They ate in comfortable silence at first, the sound of clinking forks and the faint hum of the city outside filling the room. But as they finished, Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. "I've been thinking about everything you told me," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "And I want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what. We'll face this together." Sophia's eyes filled with tears and she squeezed his hand tightly. "Thank you, Ethan. That means more to me than you know." Over the next few weeks, Ethan made good on his promise. He rearranged his schedule, delegating responsibilities at work to spend more time with Sophia. He accompanied her to every appointment, sitting beside her in the waiting room and holding her hand during consultations. He researched treatment options tirelessly, connecting with specialists and seeking second opinions to ensure she received the best care possible. Through it all, Ethan found himself rediscovering the depth of his love for Sophia. The moments they shared, whether it was a quiet evening at home, a walk in the park, or simply sitting together in the hospital, became infinitely precious. For the first time in years, he truly saw her, not as an extension of himself or as the woman he had married, but as a person with her own fears, dreams, and strength. Sophia, too, seemed to transform. Though the diagnosis weighed heavily on her, she carried herself with a quiet resilience that inspired everyone around her. She continued volunteering at the shelter, finding solace in helping the children and connecting with others who faced challenges of their own. One afternoon, as they left the hospital after a routine checkup, Sophia turned to Ethan and said, "There's something I want to do." "Anything," Ethan replied without hesitation. "I want to take you to the shelter," she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and nervousness. "I want you to see the place that's been so important to me." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I'd love that." The following day they arrived at St. Mary's shelter together. Ethan felt a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as he stepped inside the familiar building, this time not as a spy but as a guest. The children greeted Sophia with enthusiasm, their laughter filling the room as they rushed to hug her. Ethan watched in awe as she moved through the space, her warmth and kindness shining through in every interaction. She introduced him to the staff, including Matt, who shook Ethan's hand with a friendly smile. "She's a rock star around here," Matt said, nodding toward Sophia. "I don't know how we'd manage without her." "I believe it," Ethan replied, his voice tinged with pride. As the day went on, Ethan began to understand why the shelter meant so much to Sophia. It wasn't just a place to volunteer, it was a refuge, a source of purpose and connection. The children's stories, their resilience and joy despite the challenges they faced, moved him deeply. When they returned home that evening, Ethan turned to Sophia and said, "I want to help. Whatever the shelter needs, funding, resources, anything, I'll make it happen." Sophia smiled, her eyes brimming with gratitude. That would mean so much to them. "Thank you, Ethan." In the weeks that followed, Ethan became a regular presence at the shelter. He used his resources and influence to launch initiatives that transformed the space, from renovating the building to funding educational programs for the children. But more importantly, he immersed himself in the work, connecting with the people and finding a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. Through their shared efforts, Ethan and Sophia grew closer than ever. They laughed, cried, and leaned on each other in ways they hadn't in a long time. The walls that had once separated them crumbled, replaced by a bond that felt unbreakable. But the journey was not without its challenges. There were moments of fear and doubt, days when the weight of Sophia's illness seemed unbearable. Yet, through it all, they faced each obstacle together, finding strength in each other and in the community they had built around them. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their penthouse, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Sophia turned to Ethan with a look of quiet determination. "There's something I've been thinking about," she said. "What is it?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle. "I want to write a book," she said, her eyes shining with both excitement and vulnerability. "Not just about my journey, but about the people I've met. The children at the shelter, the families, the resilience and kindness I've seen in the face of hardship. Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with admiration. I think that's a beautiful idea, and I'll help you every step of the way. Sophia reached for his hand, her grip firm and steady. Thank you, Ethan, for everything. Months later, as the first copies of Sophia's book rolled off the press, Ethan felt a surge of pride that surpassed anything he had ever experienced. The book, titled Finding Grace, Stories of Hope and Resilience, became an instant bestseller, touching hearts around the world and shining a light on the work of shelters like St. Mary's. Sophia's health continued to improve with treatment, and while the road ahead remained uncertain, they faced it with a renewed sense of purpose and unity. Together, they had weathered the storm, emerging stronger and more connected than ever before. Ethan had learned the most important lesson of his life, not about business or success, but about love, humility, and the power of truly seeing the people who mattered most. And as he held Sophia's hand, watching her read to a group of children at the shelter, he realized that the greatest legacy he could ever leave wasn't in the skyscrapers that bore his name, but in the lives he touched and the love he shared.